Okay, welcome to the fourth of this series on Hegel, Marx and Dialectic by Sean Sayers. The first three, I think, have been extremely successful. I'm sure the fourth will continue that pattern. Sean will speak for something approaching 45 minutes, and then there will be time for questions. So, Sean, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Thanks again for organising these, and thanks to everybody for coming, even on a Saturday afternoon, which I greatly appreciate. Okay, the topic of my lecture today is dialectic and the analytic method. Okay, here I go then. My purpose today is to explain some of the basic presuppositions of the dialectical method and to bring out their significance in Marx's theories. I shall do so by focusing particularly and critically on G.A. Cohen, that's Jerry Cohen's account of Marxism in his Karl Marx's theory of history. In this important and influential work, Cohen contrives to give an account of Marxism in entirely non-dialectical, indeed in anti-dialectical terms. By criticizing Cohen's views, I will seek to show that the dialectical method is a necessary basis for an adequate theory of history and an indispensable part of Marx's thought. The major purpose of Cohen's book is to develop and defend a particular interpretation of historical materialism, the Marxist theory of historical development. Cohen claims that his account is what he calls an old-fashioned and a traditional one, and indeed, in certain respects, it is. For in contrast to the tendency of much recent Marxist writing, Cohen strongly emphasizes the materialistic and deterministic character of Marx's theory of history. He insists that the development of the productive forces is the primary motive force for historical change, and he portrays Marxism as a form of technological determinism. However, there are various different forms of materialism, not all of them Marxist. In particular, it has been a standard part of what Cohen calls traditional Marxist philosophy to criticize mechanical forms of materialism and to insist that a dialectical form of materialism is needed in order to comprehend the complexity and richness of concrete historical processes. Cohen manages to ignore this aspect of the traditional picture almost entirely, and what little discussion he devotes to dialectic is hostile and dismissive. The basis of this hostility is revealed by another major purpose of Cohen's book. As well as presenting an interpretation of historical materialism, he is attempting to vindicate the analytical method in philosophy. And although he does not say it in so many words, it is apparent that he regards this as irreconcilable with the dialectical aspects of Marx's work. And I think Cohen is right about this. Dialectical philosophy does indeed involve methods and assumptions, which are ultimately incompatible with those of the analytic approach. However, against Cohen, I will argue that dialectic is the necessary basis for a satisfactory view of history and an indispensable part of Marxist thought. Cohen's use of the analytic method and his rejection of dialectic leads him to give a systematically distorted account of Marx's theory of history, which is neither faithful to Marx's own thought nor adequate for an understanding of the concrete reality of history. Well, that's what I'm going to argue. What then is Cohen's analytic method? Unfortunately, Cohen himself never spells this out, although it is an important part of his purpose to defend and vindicate it. First, it should be noticed that a philosophy can be described as analytical in two different senses. One may mean by this term simply that the philosophy is part of the modern tradition of analytical philosophy. Now, Cohen's work is certainly analytical in this sense. Cohen himself talks of, and I quote, the standards of clarity and rigor which distinguish 20th century analytical philosophy. However, these virtues are not peculiar to analytical philosophy. Indeed, they are not even particularly characteristic of it. Anyone who has read a representative selection of work in this tradition will be well aware that all too often it is needlessly obscure in style and not noticeably more rigorous in argument than the work of any other major school of philosophy. Clarity and rigor are the virtues of good philosophy, of good thought in all fields. They are no monopoly of analytical philosophy. Cohen's work has these virtues, I believe, to a high degree, but that is because it is good philosophy, and by good philosophy, I mean philosophy well thought out and well argued. As you'll see, I don't agree with it. But it has these virtues because it is good philosophy, Cohen's work, not because it is in the analytical tradition. Modern analytical philosophy has been a diverse tradition, and it is not easy to make generalizations about it. But that is not my purpose. Cohen's philosophy is also analytical in a further and deeper sense. It is analytical not merely in its style and form, but in its very presuppositions and content. It is analytical in a very traditional sense. Like the philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries, Cohen relies on the methods of analysis. He insists upon analyzing the whole that he's considering into its component parts. He insists upon separating and isolating the different elements and aspects of the given concrete totality and considering and defining these in isolation. The effect of this method is to produce a fragmented and atomized picture of reality. Underlying this method, as Cohen makes clear, is what could be called a logic of external relations. According to Cohen, things are what they are and have their essential nature in themselves, quite independently of the relations in which they stand. In general, things, or terms, as Cohen likes to talk about, are not affected by their relations or context. In other words, relations are external to and independent of the things or terms related. He says the terms bound by relations do not belong to the structure these relations constitute. One is reminded of Locke's view that relation is, and I quote, not contained in the real existence of things, but is something extraneous and superinduced. Things are what they are, that is to say, they have their being purely in themselves and quite independently of the context of their relations. This logic is rejected by dialectical philosophy. Dialectics insists that in order to understand the concrete nature of things, it is vital to see them in the context of their interconnections with other things within a wider whole. According to dialectic, concrete and particular things are always and essentially related, connected to, and interacting with other things within a larger totality. This context of relations is internal and essential to the nature of things, not external and accidental, as I covered very briefly in an outline in my first lecture. By contrast, the analytical approach, with its logic of external relations, has the effect of removing things from their context and producing an abstract account of them. It has the effect of fragmenting the world into a series of disconnected atomic particulars and thereby producing a mechanical account of reality. And to substantiate and illustrate these points, let me now turn to Marx's theory of history and Cohen's account of it. Cohen's account of Marxism is closely based on Marx's 1859 preface to a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. An important and valuable part of Cohen's work consists in the careful and detailed accounts he gives of the various theoretical terms that Marx uses in it. However, although Cohen's analyses of the meanings of particular terms are often very helpful, the general picture that emerges of Marx's theory is more questionable. For example, Cohen's discussion of the notion of productive forces is useful and important. The productive forces of a society are composed mainly of the means of production, that is, the instruments of production and raw materials, and labor power. The relations of production, on the other hand, are the economic relations of a society. A set of economic relations prevailing in a particular society constitutes its economic structure, its economic basis. So far, so good. However, Cohen insists that forces of production and relations of production be regarded as entirely distinct and separate from each other. The productive forces are one thing, the relations of production another. And I quote, he says, productive forces are not part of the economic structure. And again, he says, production relations alone and not productive forces constitute the economic structure. The separation of the different elements and aspects of society is certainly.
I've got it. Here.
Is certainly an essential part of any valid account of it. Analysis, the distinction of different things, is an indispensable feature of all understanding and all knowledge. Dialectic does not deny this. Indeed, dialectic goes further and insists that analysis should not be regarded as a merely intellectual and mental process, as a purely conceptual and logical activity, the work of thought alone. For in the concrete historical process itself, different aspects and features separate themselves. The division and conflict between forces and relations of production, for example, is a real historical distinction, a part of the process of actual economic development. And only subsequently does it come to be grasped and reflected accurately in economic thought. Nothing is cloudier and less helpful than the attempt to merge all distinctions together and insist that in reality all is one, as though, in Marx's words, this separation had forced its way from the textbook into real life and not, on the contrary, from real life into the textbooks. So dialectic does not deny the reality of distinctions, nor the need for them in thought. But it does insist that in concrete reality, different and opposed things are also in unity. It rejects the exclusive, rigid, absolute, either-or distinctions of analytical thought. In particular, forces of production and relations of production are different and conflicting aspects of a single process, the productive activity of people in society. These different aspects always exist in unity. Their unity, as well as their difference, must be recognized if their nature is to be properly understood. Thus, productive forces are productive forces only in the context of certain relations of production. A machine, for example, requires people to build, operate, and maintain it. Only given these is it a productive force. A machine is a productive force only in the context of in which it is employable productively. No doubt it is possible to remove a machine entirely from its surrounding social relations and consider it purely abstractly, and in isolation. And this is what Cohen does in his account of productive forces. But then one is no longer considering it as a productive force, but merely in its abstract material aspect, as a physical object. A machine is regarded in this way by the physicist or by the engineer. And this is perfectly valid and legitimate if your interest is confined to its material properties, since the machine is indeed a physical object, a certain configuration of metal and other materials, and it remains so whatever the social context in which it is placed. The historian, however, is interested in the machine not merely as a physical object, but as an instrument of social production, as a productive force. And a machine becomes a productive force only in certain contexts, only in certain relations of production. These relations are essential, that is to say, internal, and not merely external, to its being as a productive force. Similar remarks apply to labor power, the other major constituent of the productive forces. Labor power cannot be understood if it is abstracted and isolated from the social relations in which it is exercised. Human beings are essentially social creatures. Their powers and capacities are essentially social. In particular, to consider labor power in its abstract and isolated individual form is to blind oneself to one of the most significant means for its development, namely social cooperation. Cooperative production, that is, socially coordinated, as opposed to mere individual production, not only increases the labor power of the individual in a variety of ways, it also brings what Marx calls a new power into being, quote, the social productive power of labor, or the productive power of social labor. As Marx says, and I quote again, not only have we here an increase in the productive power of the individual by means of cooperation, but the creation of a new power, namely the collective power of the masses. And this new power, this new collective power, is more than a sum of its parts. An observation by Napoleon cited by Engels well illustrates this. The French cavalry, he says, were poor horse riders, but well organized and disciplined. The Mamelukes, who they were fighting, on the other hand, were excellent horsemen, but undisciplined. The result, according to Napoleon, was that 2 Mamelukes were undoubtedly more than a match for 3 Frenchmen. 100 Mamelukes were equal to 100 Frenchmen. 300 Frenchmen could generally beat 300 Mamelukes, and 1,000 Frenchmen invariably defeated 1,500 Mamelukes. Labor power then cannot be defined in isolation from social relations, since social cooperation itself is a powerful productive force. Modern labor in particular is essentially social labor. In engaging in it, people develop their powers and capacities as social powers and capacities. But when the laborer cooperates systematically with others, he strips off, this sounds like a quote from Marx to me, he strips off the fetters of his individuality and develops the capabilities of his species. Yes, indeed, that is a quote from Marx. So here too, the conclusion is the productive forces and relations of production cannot be entirely separated and abstracted from each other. The productive forces are what they are only in the context of the appropriate relations of production. These relations are thus internal and essential to them, not purely external and distinct. Now, Cohen supports his account of the forces and relations of production with a discussion of the distinction between nature and society. According to Cohen, and I quote, he says, the distinction between forces and relations of production is, in Marx, one of a set of contrasts between nature and society. The matter or content of society is nature, whose form is the social form. In Cohen's account of these contrasts, there is the same analytic tendency to make absolute and rigid distinctions between these opposites, where a recognition of their essential relations and unity is also needed. Cohen, in fact, sees that in concrete circumstances, society and nature always exist in unity. However, his method and logic preclude him from incorporating this insight into his theory. And he insists that these aspects are logically, or as he puts it, conceptually distinct and must in thought be held apart. He writes, viewed physically, production appears stripped of its social form. Production in its asocial aspect is material production, this being the content of production. And that content may be described in illuminating abstraction from the form with which it is integrated. So if we look through the social form, we discern something conceptually separate from it, namely material production. Well, it is certainly vital to make a distinction between the material and the social. Moreover, Cohen is right to stress that Marxism, as a form of materialism, sees the material level as the primary determinant of historical development. But Cohen makes this an either-or matter. Society and nature, form and content, are portrayed as exclusive opposites, with the social form made entirely external to and logically independent of the material content. The dialectical view, by contrast, is that these opposites, as well as being different and opposed, interact and interpenetrate. And it rejects any rigid antithesis here, as though, in Marx's words, these were two separate things, and man did not always have before him an historical nature and a natural history. At times, Cohen himself sees this. For example, he says, and I quote, he says, the material description captures a society's underlying nature. In this sense of nature, nature is, of course, a product of history, changing in and as a result of social forms. Humanity, in social organization, thrusts itself against its environment, altering it and its own nature, for it develops its own powers and needs in the course of the encounter. That's Cohen. But at other times, and unfortunately, it seems to me these are the more characteristic ones, he ignores this interaction and describes history as a process of what he calls adjustment to nature, as though nature were a purely external and immutable constraint to which society has to conform. This is not a satisfactory way of seeing things. Nature and society are not purely external to each other. On the contrary, they interpenetrate and mutually transform each other. Society not only adapts itself to nature, but also, and on an ever-increasing scale, society adapts and transforms nature to its needs. The rigid analytic separation of the natural from the social tends to blind these facts. Like Feuerbach, as described by Marx, he tends not to see, in Marx's words, how the sensuous world around him is not a thing given directly for all eternity, remaining ever the same, but the product of industry and the state of society. These problems come out clearly in Cohen's attempt to assimilate Marx's ideas to those of the sophists. He writes, and I quote, "Social arrangements cannot alter physical necessity, but social arrangements can be altered. When they are confused with the necessities they arrange, they appear to partake of the immutability of the latter. The sophist distinction between nature and convention is the foundation of all social criticism, and Marx's distinction is a development of it." End of quote. Physical necessities, if by that is meant the laws of nature, cannot be altered. That is true. But nature can be altered by human activity. It is not immutable. The development of human productive powers enables human beings to control nature and to overcome the constraints of their environment, not by transcending or abolishing the laws of nature, but by using them. Freedom, in Engel's words, is based upon the recognition, or in Hegel's words too, as a matter of fact, the recognition of necessity. For Marx, social revolution is not just a matter of changing the social form on the basis of an unaltered and unalterable nature. The sophists indeed said, nature is fixed, but human conventions and social forms are alterable. But Marx, it seems to me, is profounder than this. He maintains that social forms are not merely conventional and not changeable just at will. Definite material conditions of production impose definite social forms, and it is through the development of material conditions that social relations change. Humans, through labor, alter nature in accordance with their need and are, in the process, altered by it. There is an interaction here, and I quote Marx. He says, "Labor is a process in which both man and nature participate. He opposes himself to nature as one of her own forces in order to appropriate nature's productions in a form adapted to his own wants. By thus acting on the external world and changing it, he at the same time changes his own nature." Marx's social criticism, therefore, has an entirely different basis from that of the sophists. For Marx, socialism is not simply an alternative form of society, an ideal which it is possible to realize because social forms are merely conventional and alterable. For Marx, socialism is the outcome of a real and present social movement, which is the product of the material forces at work in present capitalist society. The social criticism Marx talks of is a material and practical one. And I quote a passage from the German Ideology, which I quoted previously, and I'll probably quote again. He said, Marx and Engels say, "Communism for us is not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement, which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from the premises now in existence." At the basis of Cohen's Marxism, as I've emphasized, is the philosophical theory of external relation. It is now time to focus attention on this theory and to criticize it. According to Cohen, society is made up of people and productive forces. These are what he calls the terms of society, the substantial entities, the material elements, related by social relations to make up society. And I quote him, he says, Persons and productive forces are the only terms bound by production relations. These relations, Cohen insists, are external to, separate and distinct from, the terms related, and I quote, "The terms bound by relations do not belong to the structure those relations constitute." Cohen discusses these views with reference to the following passages from Marx. Marx says, "He only becomes a slave in certain relations. A cotton spinning jenny is a machine for spinning cotton. It becomes capital only in certain relations. Torn from these relationships, it is no more capital than gold itself is money." But Marx also writes, and I quote again from another place, "To be a slave or to be a citizen are social determinations, the relationship of man A to man B." And Marx also says, again in another place, "Capital is not a thing, but rather a definite social production relation, belonging to a definite historical formation of society, which is manifested in a thing." Now, commenting on these passages, Cohen writes, and I quote, "Marx describes capital, slaves, and other things in two divergent ways. On the one hand, he insists that capital is a relation and not like a machine, a thing. But on the other hand, he allows that it may be a thing, for example, a machine placed in certain relations. The two forms of speech are incompatible." And Cohen then goes on to argue that it is incorrect to talk of capital or a slave as a relation. Capital, he insists, is a particular sort of thing, that is, a machine, or for example, a machine, placed in certain social relations. And likewise, a slave is a different sort of thing, a person in certain relations. Now, to make this point, Cohen appeals to G.E. Moore's concept of a relational property, which Moore developed at the beginning of the last century. He says, this is Cohen, "A husband is a man related by marriage to a woman. Is not also a relationship of marriage. Being a husband is a property of that man, one he has in virtue of that relationship, and commonly styled a relational property. Being capital and being a slave are similarly relational properties of means of production and men. More specifically, they are social relational properties, whereas being means of production and being a man are not. The latter are possessed independently of the social form. Remove the social form in thought experiment, and those properties persist." So Cohen here wants to distinguish what he calls relational from other properties. The idea is that some properties, those material properties which make a man and a machine, are more basic and essential, that is, they're internal, than the relational properties. The social relations, the social form that these things assume, being a slave or being capital, are by contrast inessential and external, purely relational. Well, this whole picture, seems to me, is questionable. Productive forces are productive forces only in the context of the necessary relations of production. In the absence of these, they are mere useless objects. A spinning jenny, for example, is a machine for spinning cotton only given certain relations of production. Transferred to a quite different, a Stone Age society, for example, it would be a mere physical object of no productive use. Conversely, a stone axe has no place in our society as a productive force, but only as a museum exhibit. If then by thought experiment a social form is removed from capital, what is left is not a productive force, but a mere physical object. Similar arguments apply to the other examples discussed by Cohen. People are essentially social animals. Their social relations are not external and inessential to their nature as human beings. This was certainly Marx's view. He said, the further back we trace the course of history, the more does the individual appear to be independent and to belong to a larger whole. Man is a zoon politikon, in Aristotle's phrase, a social animal, in the most literal sense. He is not only a social animal, but an animal that can be individuated only within society. If by thought experiment a human being is entirely removed and abstracted from all their social relationships, they would be unlikely to survive the first few days of infancy. But even if they did, they would emerge as a mere animal of the human species without any individuality or other distinctively human characteristics. The upshot of this discussion is, again, that concrete things exist in relations, and the essential point that dialectics makes is that these relations are not merely external, but internal to the things related. The notion of a relational property to which Cohen appeals is no help to his case. It only confuses the issue. Nonetheless, a word should be said about it, since it was introduced by G.A. Moore to combat the Hegelian philosophy of internal relations that was prevalent at the time, and that has since become a standard, and it has since become a standard part of the orthodoxy of analytical philosophy. Relational properties are supposed to be those properties which a thing has simply by virtue of the relations in which it stands to other things. And such properties are contrasted with non-relational properties that are supposed to be intrinsic to the thing, regardless of its relations. The assumption underlying this distinction is, again, the doctrine of external relations, the view that relations are extrinsic and external to things. According to this theory, as we have seen, things are what they are and have their essential properties, and have the essential properties they have, quite independently of their relations to other things. Thus, the properties which things have in virtue only of their relations are supposed to be merely accidental and inessential properties. A person is a person in themselves and essentially, only accidentally do they occupy a particular social role and relate to others. Oh, at first sight, this distinction looks simple and clear-cut. But these matters are by no means as straightforward as the advocates of the notion of relational properties suggest. The problem is that all properties are relational. All the properties which things have exist by virtue of their relations. As Hegel says, properties are, in his words, the determinate relations of the thing to another thing. Property exists only as a mode of relationship between them. And he gives the following example. He says, by properties of herbs, for instance, we understand determinations which not only are proper to something, but are the means whereby this something, in its relations with other somethings, maintains itself in its own particular way, counteracting the alien influences posited in it and making its determinations effective in the other. In other words, a thing reveals the particular properties it has only through its relations to other things. Indeed, only through its opposition and negation of them, its counteracting them, as Hegel puts it. As Spinoza said, and this is a phrase that Hegel is very fond of quoting, Spinoza says, omnis determinatio est negatio. All determination is negation. Only by reflecting light in a certain way does a thing manifest its color. Only in and through its mechanical interactions with other bodies does an object manifest mass. Only through its relations to other things in space does a thing show its shape, and so on and so forth. In short, all properties are relational, and the concept of a relational property gets us nowhere. But this is not the end of the matter. The problem still remains of whether there is a useful distinction to be drawn between the intrinsic and essential properties and relations of things and their internal relations on the one hand, and their extrinsic, external, and inessential properties and relations on the other. The strong Hegelian view is that all relations are internal, as I described in my first lecture. Here, however, all that I need to argue is that the opposite extreme, Cohen's position, that relations are external, intrinsic, and extrinsic, to the nature of things, is incoherent and unsatisfactory. Some, at least, of the relations of a thing must be internal. And in particular, historical materialism maintains that their social relations are internal and essential features of the nature of both people and productive forces. Things and relations are not purely external to each other, not absolutely distinct and separate. These are not either or exclusive categories. In concrete reality, these opposites in Hegelian language pass into each other. They exist in unity. Now, this sort of language, no doubt, has a mysterious sound to it and may well appear cloudy and evasive, as Cohen charges, but it is not so. On the contrary, it embodies the crucially important idea of dialectic that concrete things must be understood in the context of their relations and in a dynamic fashion. But how opposites can be united is intelligible only when we see that the relations between them are not fixed and stationary, but that opposites interpenetrate and pass into each other. To see here an abstract, isolated, individual person or thing, there a disembodied structure of social relations in the analytic manner, is no way in which to understand society. In concrete social reality, it is rather the case that people are active. They enter into social relations. They interact with other people and things according to more or less set patterns. They are active in their social roles. And in so being, they produce and reproduce their social relations. Conversely, too, their social relations enter into them and give shape and form and structure to their activities and thoughts and intentions. There is a constant process of interaction and interpenetration between a person and their social relations, and unity as well as conflict between these opposites. The same is true of the interaction of the forces and relations of production. These opposites also interact, interpenetrate, and pass into each other. I quote Marx, the concentration of the instruments of production and the division of labor are inseparable one from the other. As the concentration of instruments develops, the division develops also, and vice versa. Every big mechanical invention is followed by a greater division of labor, and each increase in the division of labor gives rise in turn to new mechanical invention. The general point is this: relations do not remain external to terms. There is no absolute division of opposition between things and relations. Things do not remain merely in themselves, shut up, closed off, and isolated from other things. Things enter into their relation. They act and interact with other things, manifest their properties. And conversely, its relations and properties enter into the thing and are its properties. This is what Hegel is saying when he writes, and I quote, "The inadequacy of the standpoint at which this," and he's referring to analytical style of philosophy, stops short, consists essentially in holding fast to the abstract thing in itself as an ultimate determination, and in opposing to the thing in itself the determinateness and manifoldness of the properties. Whereas, in fact, the thing in itself essentially possesses this external reflection within itself and determines itself to be the thing with its own determinations, a thing endowed with properties. But I've been arguing that terms and relations, productive forces and relations of production, the material and the social aspects of society must not be regarded as entirely distinct and separate from each other. In concrete conditions, these are contradictory opposites that interpenetrate and exist in unity. In response, no doubt, the objection will be made that I am misrepresenting the analytic approach and being unfair to Cohen in my criticism. Analysis, it will be said, is a tool of thought, and it is the peculiar power of thought to be able to abstract and to separate, in theory, things which in reality are inseparably united. Indeed, Cohen defends his method in just these terms. He writes, "Given a certain level of development of the productive forces, a certain set of production relations or social form is appropriate, but we may also we may always abstract from the social form and display the current state of the relation between man and nature and the material relations between men underlying their social relations. The relationship between man and nature is mediated by the social form. It does not occur outside it. The development of nature described in socio-neutral terms is therefore an abstraction, but it is a theoretically important abstraction. Elsewhere, Cohen describes such abstractions as illuminating ones, and indeed they are, so long as it is remembered that they are abstractions, and that in concrete reality, matter and form, nature and man are also essentially related. The analytic approach, however, and its underlying either-or logic, requires that each term is isolated from its opposite, and that an impassable logical gulf is created between them. This method produces abstractions, to be sure, but not illuminating ones. According to Cohen, there is no logical connection between terms and relations, form and content, the material and the social levels. The relations between them are purely external and contingent. They are, as he puts it, conceptually separate. He illustrates this by saying, and I quote, "We may envisage a complete material description of a society, a socio-neutral description, from which we cannot deduce its social form. It will provide extensive information detailing the material abilities and needs of persons, the resources and facilities available to them, their scientific knowledge. But ownership patterns, distribution of rights and duties, social roles will go unremarked." Here we have the atomized and fragmented picture of the world, which is the inevitable outcome of the analytic method. There is no necessary connection here between the material aspects of society and its social forms. This is Hume's picture of the world. He said, all events seem entirely loose and separate. One event follows another, but we can never observe any tie between them. They seem conjoined, but never connected. According to this logic, there are no necessary connections between events. Any event could follow any other. It is, as is put, logically possible for any sort of society to be associated with any sort of material means of production. Marx's idea was quite different. He said, in a rather sloganistic way, simplistic way perhaps, but anyway, he said, the hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill society with the industrial capitalist. The necessary connection between a society's productive forces and its social relations was one of Marx's great discoveries. It may seem possible to have any sort of society, a socialist society even, based upon the hand mill. Indeed, a large and influential body of romantic and utopian thinking is based upon just this idea. According to Marx, however, this is not possible. It is not, that is to say, a real historical possibility. A scientific understanding of events involves a knowledge of the laws and necessities governing them. Hence, it involves a knowledge of the real and concrete possibilities inherent in the situation, as opposed to the merely apparent and abstract or logical possibility. Cohen, like other philosophers in the analytic tradition, devotes considerable time and ingenuity to exploring various unreal but logically possible cases through what he calls thought experiments. However, to say that something is logically possible means only that it is not self-contradictory. And as Hegel says, and I quote, every content can be brought under this form, since nothing is required except to separate it from the relations in which it stands. Hence, any content, however absurd and nonsensical, can be viewed as possible. For this reason, it seems to me, questions of logical possibility should be of no interest to philosophers, historians, or anyone else concerned with the proper subject matter of philosophy, as Hegel says, is actuality. And Marx would surely have agreed, at least with the spirit of this. As one comes to understand reality scientifically, one comes to grasp the real connections between apparently unrelated events. A knowledge of the concrete nature of things involves a knowledge of the laws governing their necessary processes of development and their connections with other things. This is Hegel again. Usually we regard things as unaffected by each other. Everything is thus put outside every other. But the aim of philosophy is to banish indifference and to ascertain the necessity of things. By that means, there is to stand over it and against its other. Conversely, Hegel says, the less education a man, or in other words, the less he knows of the specific connections of the objects to which he directs his observation, the greater is his tendency to launch out into all sorts of empty possibilities. As I've been arguing, the analytic picture of the world and the logic of external relations have precisely the effect that Hegel here describes. The philosophical method, this philosophical method, separates things from their relations. It portrays things as loose and separate, merely contingently and externally related. This is Hume's picture of the world, as I've already said, and as Hume himself was well aware, it leads to total skepticism about science. For on this account, there can be no valid basis for theories of law-like and necessary behavior of things. It is therefore incapable of illuminating Marx's theory of history. This fragmented Humean picture of the world underlies a great deal of analytical philosophy, and it is at the basis of Cohen's account of Marxism. Cohen, of course, knows perfectly well there is a connection between the material productive forces and social relations, and that it is the purpose of Marx's theory of history to describe this connection. Cohen himself does not believe that there could be a socialist society based upon hand production. Nevertheless, he insists that the connection between the forces and relations of production is not a logical or a deductive one. Rather, he maintains, the relation is a purely contingent, external, and Humean causal one. Cohen, in other words, accepts Hume's premises. He accepts Hume's fragmented picture of the world, but he is unwilling to accept Hume's skeptical conclusion, which was, though we Hume, this is Cohen again. Though we cannot deduce social relationships from a material description, we can infer them more or less confidently by dint of general or theoretical knowledge. That's Cohen's assertion. But given Cohen's premises, this cannot be done. Starting, as Cohen does, from the analytic picture of the world as composed of discrete and unconnected, loose and separate particulars, it is not possible to infer anything beyond the immediate given. Vague and unexplained book of inferences will not do here. Hume, by contrast, spells out the skeptical implications of the analytic view with uncompromising clarity. He says this is human. It is evident that Adam, with all his science, would never have been able to demonstrate the course of nature must continue uniformly the same. Nay, I will go further and assert he could not so much as prove by any probable arguments the future must be conformable to the past. Marxism claims to give an account of the laws of historical development. It maintains that there is a necessary connection, an internal relation, between the development of the productive forces and changes in the relations of production, and in the political and ideological superstructure. This theory cannot be understood in terms of a logic which has the effect of fragmenting social and historical processes into isolated parts and denying the connection between them. This requires a dialectical approach. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Sean. We'll take comments in the usual way. If you can raise your hand, by which I mean the yellow hand that Zoom provides you, we'll take them in order as to who raises their hand, and we have a bit of time for questions. Howard. Howard, you're muted.
Yes. Okay. I came in late, so I may have missed some things, but I have 2 points. One goes to the question you just finished on how productive relations are related to relations of production. And I think it's important the other way around. In other words, capital relation gives you the steam engine. And that goes to the question of the adequacy, the way Marx sometimes talks and Hegel talks of the adequacy to the concept. So the adequacy to the concept of value, or adequacy to the concept of capital. And that kind of moves the productive forces, moves the development of labor and so forth. So I think that's that's an important emphasis. I have also a couple of quotes from Marx, very brief quotes that I'd like your comment on. The first is, relations can be expressed only in ideas. That's at 164 of the Grundrisse, the 1973 edition. And the second is, in general, a relation can obtain a particular embodiment and become individualized only by means of abstraction. So I'll read those again, and that's at 142. I'll read those again. Relations can be expressed only in ideas, and in general, a relation can obtain a particular embodiment and become individualized only by means of abstraction. Thanks.
Right. Let me just make a note of that. Yes, I mean the question of, you say capital is the engine. Is that right? Did I get it right?
Well, the quote that you mentioned was, the steam engine gives you capital. And it goes the other way around. In other words, the Industrial Revolution is a product of the capital relation.
Well, it's both, isn't it? I mean, isn't there again a sort of interaction here? I think one of the problems that I'm criticizing in Cohen's view, I mean, which I would go on to do if I had more time, is that it produces a very, ultimately he gives a very mechanistic picture of historical materialism, it seems to me, in which, and I think if you say that, it's capital that produces the steam engine, not vice versa, aren't you in danger of doing? It's a sort of economic determinism, aren't you in danger of doing the same thing? Isn't there? Don't they develop in interaction and in tandem? Now, it may well be that capital, I'm not sure of this myself, but I mean, it may be, I'm not sure, but it may be that one no doubt is primary, and certainly in particular historical periods, one or other of those will be the primary engine, the primary force. But there's always going to be an interaction there. And I think if you deny that, you get a very sort of mechanistic picture emerging. And Cohen is really a sort of technological determinist at the end of the day, I think, in a rather simplistic way. And I think that comes out of the sort of things that I'm criticizing in this approach.
Yes.
Let me. Should I just? I mean, very briefly on the other quotes you give. I'm not sure I quite understand them. I'd have to see, in their context. You say relations can be expressed only in ideas. Well, that's, relations exist in reality. I'm not quite sure what that means, and I think I really don't understand that. And the others, ditto with the second quote you had, relations are only embodied by means of abstractions. It's the same sort of thought, isn't it? I'd have to look at that, but I mean, it seems to me that Marx is realist about relations. I mean, they're part of the real structure of the world. They don't exist only in ideas.
Okay, Dave.
But wait a minute, before we move on, Howard, did you want to come back on the first point?
Well, the point, I agree with you completely about technological determinism and denying the influence of material things on relations. But my real what I'm interested in is raising our level of awareness about this idea of the adequacy of something to its concept. So the adequacy, for example, at the end of the Grundrisse, Marx asks whether circulating capital or fixed capital is more adequate to the concept of capital. Well, that's interesting, and so we can see the whole development then of capital and labor and so forth, animated by this becoming adequate to what capital is.
Gosh, that sounds sort of dangerously Hegelian idealism to me. I mean, as though the concept determined the development of things rather than the other way around.
Well,
again, I think Marx at times does in fact talk like that. But I would, if he does, I think I've got to part company with him.
I think it's important also that he says at another point, political economists just have the tangible or the ideal. And Marx talks about the supersensible. And so it's not just reality or ideas, it's reality as we can touch it, we can taste it, and so forth, and reality as it's causally efficacious, the way relations are, but not perceptual.
God, yeah. One really has to be. Of course, there are non-perceptual aspects of reality. I would certainly accept that. But I think one has to be very clear about what exactly is being claimed in order to sort of engage with those thoughts. And I'm not.
Very much.
Okay, let's bring Dave in.
Yeah, I'd like to try and give my interpretation of that quote that Howard gave from the Grundrisse there, where he says that that external relationships are individualized through the process of abstraction, by means of abstraction. Is that what you said, Howard?
It's at 142, and it's in general, a relation can obtain a particular embodiment and become individualized only by means of abstraction. And the context for this is his discussion of West Africa, where a bar is used to establish a numerical relation between two products that are exchanged.
Would you mind if I just give my take on that? Because I think this is actually a really crucial question. My understanding of this is that it relates to the process and practice of cognition and how abstraction takes place, because it is true, I think this is a good point, that through this process, external things and relationships are individualized, because we take them out of reality, don't we? That we proceed from the immediacy of sense perception, of sensation, and then we start to process, we go through a process of abstraction, which means that we are taking things out of nature. We're processing our sensations that we've extracted from our experience, and through the immediacy of living perception, we're going beyond that and taking that through our thought and brain work, if you like. Do you mind if I just give you a short quote from Lenin, from the philosophical notebooks, that illustrates this process? Or would you mind, Paul? Take a minute.
Go.
Okay, this is in Lenin's Conspectus of Hegel's Science of Logic, and it's Lenin's interpretation of rather a long quote from Hegel that I won't give you, but this is what he says. He says, thought proceeding from the concrete to the abstract, providing it is correct, does not get away from the truth, but comes closer to it. The abstraction of matter, of a law of nature, the abstraction of value, in short, all scientific abstractions reflect nature more deeply, truly, and completely. And then he says, from living perception to abstract thought, and from this to practice, such is the dialectical path of the cognition of truth, the cognition of objective reality. Well, this is really what I'm trying to this is the point that I think Howard has raised here, actually, that the process of abstraction means that, that the appearance, we're taking things out of nature, but only in the process of putting things back into it, through trying to understand its laws and, the way in which nature operates. So this is simply, we have to travel away from nature in order to get closer to it. That's really what I'm trying to say. And the process of thought itself takes us out of nature and actually in a sense, thought processes make this very difficult because they're strangling living moments. There are many moments that we can't capture, we can't photograph them. We connect them up. We connect these photographs, to use that comparison, into a motion picture through the process of abstraction. But there are many moments of this process that we can't capture. We can't get it all. Anyway, that's my take on Howard's quote from the Grundrisse there, which I think is absolutely crucial because it's how we think dialectically, isn't it? Isn't this whole process of abstraction a dialectical one where we start from sense perception, we start from the immediacy of sensation, but the process of living perception itself means that we have to go through concepts and categories and brain work in order to return to nature at a higher level.
Yes, I entirely agree. I entirely agree with that. But I don't think, I'm not quite sure how it bears on the sort of issues I was criticizing Cohen for. I think his way of abstraction, form of abstraction, does not get closer to the reality of things. I guess that's what I was saying. It separates things into sort of absolute, it sort of fragments a reality, which is in fact a unity.
Isn't this the meaning of Howard's quote from the Grundrisse? Isn't this what Marx is trying to say in the Grundrisse, in this quotation that Howard's given?
Very possibly. I don't know, to be quite honest with you. I'd have to look at that in more detail in its context. Is that what you were suggesting, Howard? You're muted.
I've said enough, so I'll pass.
Okay.
Okay. Have we other contributions? Rob.
Once again, Sean, I think your critique of Cohen is brilliant and compelling. But one set of terms that you didn't use in all of this was base and superstructure, which relates, I think, to perhaps the previous discussion about the forces of production and their relationship to the relations of production. And seems to me that, as I think you're pointing out, if you take a very atomistic view of this, then you can generate the technological determinism that you find in Cohen. But if you take a more dialectical view, you see these things as it were, interpenetrating, although you might give a sort of an idea of relative importance at different times, at any rate, to different aspects of the whole. And that just brings me to the question, again, that I'm struggling with, which is to get on top of this concept of internal relations, which I think is a very important one, as you've pointed out. But obviously, if all relations are internal, and we take internal relations to be in some sense the essence of an object, a change in any of those relations changes the object, changes the identity of the object. And I wondered if we don't need some concept of the relative importance of the different internal relations that may go to characterize an object, and whether that's a way, this idea of relative importance rather than internal external.
Yes, I again very much agree with that. Of course, you're quite correct to say that, theoretically, any change in the relations of a thing changes its nature. But, if those relations are very sort of distant and unimportant to the thing, as it were, then the change is going to be minuscule, imperceptible. It's almost just a theoretical view to say that all relations are internal, and there certainly is but it's a there's a sort of a gradual difference here between important relations, internal relations, if you like, and rather distant and peripheral ones, external relations. the analytic approach makes this into a sharp sort of either or divide, which I think is very well, it's just mistaken, and tends to sort of regard things as, I mean, it leads to a sort of atomism, as I was saying, which just fragments the world. And I think that's the problem with the whole approach that well that Cohen takes, and more generally, I mean, it's a sort of extreme form of analytic approach, and it's that's what I'm criticizing.
Okay.
Now,
We haven't.
and I agree about internal. One couldn't make the same series of arguments, I think, about base and superstructure, as you say. I mean, just exactly that. In fact, Cohen does. I could have run the whole. It would have got rather repetitious and tedious. But I could have run the whole argument that I was making about the relation of base and superstructure too. I just focused on force and relations to production because that's what Cohen really concentrates on in his book.
Okay, we've got a question from David, who hasn't got a mic. So I'll read the question out in case people can't read it. He'd ask if you'd expand a bit more on analytical thought experiments that are meant to show the logical possibility of some entity. You said that they do so through abstracting from the relationship of this entities, and that anything could be shown possible this way. I am interested to know more about this misuse of abstraction. Do you have any references where I could read more about a dialectical critique to this aspect of analytical philosophy? That's from David Lorenz.
Well, thanks, David. Yes, I mean, I quote from Hegel. I mean, again, I've taken what I was saying, straight out of Hegel's logic. In fact, where he makes the points that I was making, that in theory, anyway, anything can be regarded as logically possible if you completely deny all its relations with other things. What makes the thing, necessary is that it's connected in a law-like way with other entities. Separate. I mean, the point that Hegel's making and the point that I was making is that if you separate it off, if you simply sever all its relations with other things, then in theory, anything is possible. And what I'm saying is that, in effect, that's what Cohen's method does. It says, in theory, it is logically possible for any form of social relations to be connected with, associated with any form of any sorts of productive forces of production. That can't, Marx says almost exactly the opposite. He says, the hand mill gives you society with the feudal law, the steam mill society with industrial capitalism. That's to say that the forces of production and the relations of production are necessarily connected. Perhaps that's too crude and simple on the other side, I think. I mean, that would seem to suggest, well, it raises a very important political issue, doesn't it? Could, on that view, socialism have been created in Russia in 1917? Could form of socialism been created in China in 1949, etc., etc.? I mean, that's, it has immediate and important political impact. And I think, in a way, I'd want to qualify. I mean, I think Marx's remark is too simple. His historical development is more messy and more complex than than that quote suggests. But on the other hand, at least Marx, the whole implication of Marx's approach is that there is a connection. I think it's his great discovery, as a matter of fact, that there is a necessary connection between the productive forces, the economic level of society, and its social arrangements. I mean, that is, in a sentence, historical materialism. If you deny that, you know, if you undermine that, I mean, it's not as though Cohen denies it. He doesn't see that he's denying it. But by making that relationship a purely external one, he is in effect denying it. He is in effect taking a sort of Humean and fragmented view of, you know, he says there's no connection between social relations are conventional, material, you know, and can be changed at will. That is simply not Marxism.
Any other questions or comments? We've got a few comments in the chat box, but no explicit questions, including Nick telling us that you can't be half pregnant, which is one way of explaining this. Any other questions? I mean, for me, Sean, you're absolutely right. The whole point of dialectical thinking is that you have that contradiction between the method of abstraction, which takes things out of the world, and the necessity of putting them back in to make sense. Otherwise, I would go as far as to say that most philosophy, in its use of analytical methods, is very similar to aesthetics. You know, a Jackson Pollock painting or Kandinsky are every bit as beautiful and formed from their own particular logic of meaning. And the same in much philosophy, but it makes little sense if you can't put it back into the messy physicality of the real world. I think just on Howard's point, just one thing, where you read from Gundry's did a quote about expression, I think the issue here is a medium of language. We abstract with language. And in the act of linguistically expressing to make meaning between us, we invariably, I wouldn't say individualize, but we certainly atomize things from themselves. And the difference between Marxists who understand dialectics and those who choose not to is that we know even as we do that, we're doing that violence. Sean, I cut you off there, did I?
Yeah. No. I mean, you know, I think, you know, what, you know, I agree with what you. I mean, I just want to say that the issues I've dealt with today are very abstract, and you know, they are and philosophical, logical issues, and you know what I mean. To illustrate, really, I mean, in my first lecture, I argued that the two, or perhaps two, not the two, but two very fundamental and essential aspects of dialectic are one that, I mean, I'm taking again straight from Hegel's logic. One, that things are alterable; they're in a process of change and alteration. And two, that, as he puts it, they're finite. They're always and necessarily related to other things, and you can only understand things concretely and properly if you see them in relation. It was that latter point that I was sort of illustrating, if you like, by this critique of Cohen. It seems to me that he does not understand that, or he doesn't believe in. He rejects that aspect of dialectic, I think, to his own detriment.
Howard, you wanted to come back in?
Yes, I think, yes, I'm not muted. Okay. Yes, I want to just, on the point of abstraction, there's two kinds of abstraction. There's the abstraction which takes us away from the concrete, but there's abstraction, the power of abstraction, as it's mentioned in the preface of Capital. And there it's like the microscope, Marx says, or the chemical reagent. It allows us to exclude things that are, for the moment, not our focus, in order to get to things that are. And so those things that are can be not empirical. In other words, they're not sensuous. They're causal relationships which are which we know by their effects, like gravity. Like we know gravity by its effects. And so the same thing with social relations. We know them by their effects. So what we do is we peel away. The American philosopher Peirce talks about prescind, and that's the idea, is that we peel away and we get to the causally efficacious relationship that we can't touch, we can't perceive, that causally efficacious relationship that is driving things forward.
Mm.
Okay, have we any other comments? Any new voices who would like to be heard? Incidentally, for those of you who are posting in the chat, don't feel it's wasted. I actually copied the entire chat and it will definitely go to Sean at the end of the 6 lectures. So the comments you're making will be things that Sean will take into account as he develops this forward.
Yes, that's very helpful. Yeah, please do. Yeah, I appreciate them.
Any other questions? We're coming up to 6, but we've got 2 or 3 minutes left. I would also say these are very, to me, knowing the literature, very lucid lectures, but I can understand people who might be sitting back thinking, this is all very abstract and new to me. Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yes, I would echo that, absolutely. I mean, this is the very most, as I said, this is, and I think it needs dealing with by Marxists, but it is the most abstract, the most philosophical, the most logical. This is the logic of dialectic, and Lenin deals with it, as you said, in his philosophical notebooks, and Engels deals with it, of course. Marx hardly says anything about this, so one has to really sort of infer what Marx. I mean, I'm really talking about the philosophy of dialectic as it's developed on the basis of Marxist thought, but obviously extrapolating and inferring what what was implicit in Marxism, trying to make it explicit. And it is, it's philosopher's philosophy. What more can I say? That's where I'm coming from.
We have a question from Yazid. The concept of adequacy is not clear to me. Could you explain it, please?
What I mean, adequacy, adequacy in what context?
If you want to tell us, Yazid, what the context was to that, I get the impression it might be in terms of whether abstractions can adequately.
Oh, right, yeah.
In the context of relations.
An adequate conception of relations. Well, I mean, one that does justice to their reality, which is true and valid. I mean, isn't it another what the word from those ideas? Truth, validity, adequacy. I think they're all sort of getting at the same idea. Of course, how you decide what's true and valid and adequate is another issue altogether. And that brings us back to some of the questions about sort of the relation of thought and sensory experience that were being raised earlier.
Okay, any last comments before we sign off? Oh, David.
Yeah, on this question of the adequacy of abstractions, my understanding of that is that abstractions are never absolutely adequate. That's what drives the process of abstraction forward. That they may be adequate in a certain case and at a certain time, but as things move and develop, then they become inadequate, and that's what drives science and thought forward. So I think in terms of the process and practice of cognition, if we accept that there is one and that it's on this basis that abstraction takes place, then abstractions are only relatively adequate to certain cases and places in time.